Hello, I'm Dave Schubert, Naturalist at Beaver Lake Nature Center, and today I'd like to talk about ferns. I think everyone loves ferns. They're reminiscent of all the forest walks here at Beaver Lake, and they've been in the fossil record for over 300 million years, so they're a very, very primitive plant, and they've existed up till this time. They're found everywhere in the world, on every continent, except Antarctica. So here we're going to go through a little bit of the terminology, the parts of the fern, and how to identify them. And then afterwards, we're going to hit the trails, and I'm going to point some of the ferns out to you that you can find at Beaver Lake. Many of them right along the trail. So first, we're going to look at parts of the fern. The entire leaf, including the stem, is called the frond. Of course, you've heard that term before. The part of the fern frond that includes the leaves and the leaflets, we'll call them at this point, is called the blade of the fern. Each, what we'd call in a tree or another plant a leaflet, are called pinna and pinnae, for plural. The space in between each of those pinnae is the rachis. These terms are important if you use a field guide. The stem itself is called the stipe, and on the stipe, if there's little scales, they're called pinnules. The important part of a leaf identification, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, is how the leaves are arranged and how they're cut. So if we go over to the example ferns on the board, I'll talk about the different pinnae arrangements. We'll start first with the Christmas fern, which is one of the ferns we'll look at later on the trail. And this is what is called once cut. So from the stipe, each pinna is a single leaflet, let's call it. So that's once cut. In other words, the frond, if it was not cut at all, the blade would just be a hole, like a leaf you see on a tree. So these are considered cuts. So this is once cut, or singly pinnate. Next we have a royal fern, which is twice cut. So you see the stipe, and this would be one whole pinna, and on the pinna are pinnules. So it's once cut this way, twice cut with these pinnules. So this is a twice cut fern. Thrice cut becomes very lacy and decorative looking and kind of delicate. This is a spinulose wood fern. At any rate, we have the stem, and then this is once cut, and as on the royal fern, we have the pinnules coming off here, twice cut, and if you look real close, each of those pinnules is cut a third time. So this is called thrice cut or three pinnate. So when we walk around on the trails in a moment, I will use that terminology, once cut, twice cut, or thrice cut. So let's hit the trails. All right, as you see, we're here by the Lakeview Trail. It's the shortest trail here at Beaver Lake, but it's a trail that's packed with ferns. This trail has many of the species that you'll see at Beaver Lake, all within a few feet of the edge of the trail. So let's go down Lakeview and start looking for our ferns. The cluster just ahead of our first fern that we're going to discuss today. When I think of ferns, I think of this fern, and it also reminds me of a holiday. It's called the Christmas fern. Christmas ferns are once cut. I used that as an example at the beginning. You see the stem and the one once cut leaves. It's also an evergreen fern, and it gets its name because it's green at Christmas and it's often brought in as a holiday decoration. And also, kind of a neat thing, is you look closely at the pinnules, the pinna, and they sort of look like a stocking hanging ready for Santa. So that's an easy one to remember. It's nice dark green, thick fronds, and like I said, it stays evergreen all year. Not too much further down the trail here on the Lakeview Trail, we find Long Beach fern. This is a little bit different from the Christmas fern. It's a light green fern, and it's got a narrow triangular shape, as you see. It's very distinctive, this shape. Now, unlike the Christmas fern fronds, which grow in clusters, this fern grows singularly from a black rootstock, and they form colonies. So as you see, they're spreading out underground by the roots, interconnected, growing in single fronds. The fronds are about 12 inches long, including the stem, and the lowest leaflets droop downward. Very easy fern to identify by that characteristic. This fern is not an evergreen fern, so the new fronds will grow every spring. All right, we're still on Lakeview Trail. Just around the next bend, we have a very distinctive woodland fern called the spinulose wood fern. It has a distinctive fern form. It grows in distinct clumps and tall fronds up to 40 inches long. Now the fronds are thrice cut. This is the fern that I used in the beginning to show three-cut or thrice-cut pinnae. So it's very delicate looking and lacy in appearance. Its stalk is very long too, about 12 inches. And it has distinctive scales along the base. So that's a very characteristic feature of the spinulose wood fern, these little bracts or scales at the base of the stem. Florists commonly use this fern for decorations and bouquets. They call it the fancy fern. All right, if you've walked the Lakeview Trail before, I'm sure you've walked this stretch and seen this very interesting fern. You can't miss it because it's very tall, and its form is a little different than other ferns, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. This is the most common fern in the world. It's called the bracken fern. In fact, the word bracken is an old English word that was applied to all large ferns. So it was given to this species as a common name. It's found on edges, in open areas, pastures. So you notice there's a little sun here. It can tolerate a little bit more sun than other ferns. And the most interesting thing I find is that it grows on a long, look at this, I'm walking through some poison ivy, long stem, and the blades come from the long stem, very solid, woody stem almost, and then they grow parallel to the ground. So here's the bracken fern. Again, it can grow in depleted soils, in areas that are old farm fields. You can see it along the sides of roads. And here, it's in this kind of a clearing area on the Lakeview Trail. Here's a common fern you see growing at Beaver Lake. And again, we're on the Lakeview Trail. Now you got to be careful what you say around this fern. It's the sensitive fern. Of course, that's the oldest joke. But it's sensitive in that it's affected by the early frost. It's one of the first ferns to show frost damage, and it senesces very quickly when it gets cold. It's found in fields, woodlands, even in your garden. This happens to be a wettish area along the Lakeview Trail, so it loves this kind of rich wet soil. It's sort of a triangular shape overall, and it's pinnate, in other words, looking like a feather, similar to the oak fern, but it's much bigger and it grows in groups. Unlike the spinulose wood fern that grows as a cluster, it grows from a rhizome. You can sort of see at the base here that they arise singularly out of the ground from rhizome and spread throughout the area. So they're not in any organized clumps like the spinulose wood fern. Again, a very common fern. Keep your eyes open on Lakeview Trail and other trails for the sensitive fern. All right. One of the most popular trails at Beaver Lake, the Bog Trail. And a lot of interesting ferns. Obviously, it's a wetland, so we're going to look at some wetland ferns up on the Bog Trail. And again, these can be all viewed right from the boardwalk. So let's head up the Bog Trail. As you see, we're on the Bog Boardwalk now. At the very beginning, this fern is very common to swamps and other wetlands, and of course here in the bog. This is called the marsh fern. It's growing along the boardwalk. There's an entire patch of it here. It grows singularly from a creeping rhizome. Kind of so scary. But a rhizome is a root extension, and it creates a mat of fern fronds. So you can see this whole area is the fronds of the marsh fern. It's twice cut, and it's very delicate and lacy looking. And it's one of the earlier ferns also, like the sensitive fern, to start withering during frosts. The stalk is a black color at the base. Again, very distinctive. And this fern wouldn't be growing in a woodland situation, so it's considered a wetland fern. So it's easily distinguished from other ferns, which we'll show you later, like the hay-scented fern, which has a similar growth pattern. This is the marsh fern. As the name implies, this is the royal fern. Look at how tall this is. It can be up to 4 feet tall. Again, I'm standing next to one and it starts down here, growing from hummocks in clusters. And it can grow large fronds. This is the one I used as an example of twice cut. It's starting to brown up a little bit. It's late summer. These are beautiful ferns. In fact, sometimes the leaves, the pinnae are similar looking to a black locust leaf, if you look at it closely. And it's a very beautiful regal fern. And opposite the royal fern here on the boardwalk are cinnamon ferns. Very beautiful fern, another large fern species growing in clusters, again, from these hummocks. Down here, real rich, wet soil. Again, both of these ferns, the royal fern and the cinnamon fern, are wetland ferns. It's got lance-shaped leaves, looking like a big sword lance. And the common name comes from the fertile frond, which I don't see here. And when they're covered with spores, it gives a bright brown color, like that of cinnamon. So this is the beautiful cinnamon fern. There's some older cinnamon fronds in the back there. All right, we're now walking along the Hemlock Hollow Trail. And as I came up the small rise just by the big pile of rocks that were put here long ago from farmers, I could tell this fern was here even before I saw it. I could smell in the air a faint smell of fresh cut hay or grass. This whole area beneath these beautiful hemlocks is populated by the hay-scented fern found in the Adirondacks,
Catskills, and of course here in this older forest at Beaver Lake. The hay-scented fern is a very delicate light green to yellowish fern that's thrice cut, and it's distinct from other ferns in that, similar to the marsh fern, it grows from rhizomes underground and forms huge populations. It likes partially shaded forests like this. You see it's dappled sunshine here today. And as its name implies, it gives off a faint odor of fresh cut hay. Again, you can see this fern in a huge patch off the Hemlock Hollow Trail. Okay, I kind of saved one of the most fascinating and beautiful ferns for last. This fern isn't very common at Beaver Lake. In fact, I would call it very rare. You won't see it from the edge of a trail. It's deep in the forest because it likes rich, shady sites. Oftentimes it grows in association with limestone soils, places like Green Lakes, Clark's Reservation, and other places down towards Tully. This is the maidenhair fern. It's unusual in its look. It's very dainty and delicate fern. Each black wiry stalk has two recurving pairs of leaflets. The fronds are growing flat, sort of parallel to the ground, and kind of reminiscent of the bracken fern in its growth form. And if you look closely, each leaflet is fan-shaped, resembling flowing hair, thus the name maidenhair fern.